Hi, my name is Pranav Kalidindi, and I'm a rising junior at TJ in Alexandria, Virginia. And my project and my paper is on the effect of stress on Alzheimer's progression. So, in this presentation, I'll be talking about four main things. The first one being like an overview of Alzheimer's, an overview of stress, and then a link, and finally a conclusion. So, let's just introduce you to the topic. So, chronic stress has been found as a substantial contributor to Alzheimer's patients' cognitive deterioration. These effects of stress on hippocampus function and dysregulation of the HPA axis, which is known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, led to higher cortisol levels and showed a link between stress and memory dysregulation, also known as Alzheimer's. And moreover, acute and chronic stress has been linked to increased production of amyloid beta plaques and tau tangles, which are all hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And as a result, the cellular mechanisms of memory, consolidation, and storage are all disrupted, which is why you have the effects of dementia and Alzheimer's. So in this presentation, I'll be reviewing the various ongoing research that has been going on to show how cellular network and endocrine pathways in the brain are impeded by stress and different cortisol levels. And then they eventually affect neurodegeneration in Alzheimer's and speed up the process of Alzheimer's in patients. And understanding like this interplay between stress and Alzheimer's is something that will significantly help us in the future when trying to find a cure. So first, let's talk about the overview of Alzheimer's disease. So for just some stats, 1 out of 8 people from the ages of 65 and 74 are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And that increases to 50% of people above the ages of 85 years old. And worldwide right now, there's 51.62 million people diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So you might be asking, why does Alzheimer's happen? So Alzheimer's is a result of two main pathways. So the first one being tau tangles. So tau are like these proteins that stabilize cells and neurons and these things called microtubules, which hold these neurons together. And when tau begins to tangle, it can cause neurons to lose their structure and stability, therefore causing improper signaling and other things that result in symptoms of Alzheimer's. So here's a diagram of how it looks like. So you can see that you have this stabilizing protein. So this colorful ring that you see on the top, that's a microtubule, and that's where the neurons are protected. But when you look in and you can see these like blue things lying on top, those are stabilizing protein tau. So these are like proteins that keep these intact. However, you can see in this bottom picture, in an Alzheimer's microtubule, you can see all these tau proteins are all like tangled up and they're not on the microtubule itself, causing the microtubule to kind of expand and be loose and causing for these neurons not to work properly. And the second one is amyloid beta plaques. So these amyloid beta in general is just a protein that is a byproduct of normal brain function. But when there's excess stress and excess of it, it can cluster and interfere with signaling, as I'll show you on this slide. So you can see right here, a normal neuron right here has, it looks healthy. There's no blockages around it. And you can see like the myelin sheath and everything is all healthy. But if you look here on a neuron with Alzheimer's disease, you can see that these amyloid plaques, which are these yellow furry things, they're getting in the way of these axons and in the way of these neurons. And you can see all these plaques, eventually they'll build up and interfere with the signaling. So here's just like an overview of comparing them side by side. This is a normal neuron. This is what it would be without Alzheimer's. And then if you look at the Alzheimer's neuron, you can see like this kind of like spiralish texture in the neuron, and those are the tau tangles. And then you can see on the outside these like reddish flares. Those are the amyloid plaques. So all of these together interfere with these the signaling between neurons, leading to memory loss and other symptoms of Alzheimer's. Now let's talk about stress, because stress is one of the reasons why Alzheimer's progression can increase. So let's talk about how it progresses first. So the HPA axis, which I said in the beginning, it stands for the hypothalamus, which is a part in the brain. The pituitary gland, which is the one that sends out all these like hormones and signals. And then you have your adrenal cortex. All of these combined to form the HPA axis, and they regulate the body's response to stress through the production of different hormones. So you can see here that the hypothalamus will secrete or send corticotropin releasing hormone into the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland will release the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes into the adrenal cortex, which then should be giving negative feedback to help regulate the amount of hormones that are pushed out. So although these hormones are typically normal when we're going through stress, prolonged and chronic stress can cause an excess of these hormones to be produced, and it starts to affect other areas such as ion channels and other parts of the brain, which I'll get into in a few slides. So these are three of the regions that are mainly affected by stress. So the first one, chronic stress, especially during like sensitive developmental periods like infancy, it not only affects emotions, but it also remodels the physical structure of the brain. And it remodels the dorsal or a granule cingulate cortex. So that's basically a main part of the PFC. And a study done in 2015 showed that the blockage of the corticotropin releasing factor, which is the hormone that's released when the body is perceiving stress. So it prevented the impairment of cognitive dependent tasks in PFC. So basically what this study was showing was that with stress, it was basically impairing the cognitive dependent tasks. So like memory and all those things, stress was impairing those functions in the prefrontal cortex, which is the PFC. And that's one of your main parts of your brain. And the second part is the amygdala. So the amygdala is responsible for processing information, and stress also affects the amygdala, more specifically the basolateral amygdala, also known as the BLA. And a study in 2009 done on rodents showed that when chronic stress was induced, the BLA started to become dysregulated and wouldn't function normally, which leads to memory loss and other issues that are also hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And then the last part is the hippocampus. So when the rest of the parts are dysregulated, it affects the hippocampus by impairing NMDA receptors, which are these NMDA signaling. And there's these NMDA receptors which help keep the body functioning normally. So by impairing these NMDA receptors and signaling, it causes for a progression of Alzheimer's disease. And another main thing that stress affects are ion channels. So basically, ion channels regulate electrochemical balance and also the ions that flow in and out of cells to keep them working and healthy. And they're responsible for conducting the electricity in neurons. So you might know of the synapses. So neurons send electronic signals to each other, and these ion channels play a key role in regulating that. However, an excess of cortisol, which is the hormone that's released when stress is perceived, an excess of cortisol causes a loss in proper function of these ion channels. And this cortisol keeps on getting produced when stressed. So prolonged periods of stress would lead to excessive cortisol, leading to blockages in the ion channel and other deteriorating effects. So now you may be thinking, what's the link between Alzheimer's and stress? So there's three main links. First, we see dysregulated ion channels, and then we have an altercation of steroids and an HPA axis dysfunction. So first, let's talk about the HPA axis dysfunction. So stress, as we've talked about, activates the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it releases these things called glucocorticoids, which are steroids. So these glucocorticoids can impact tau proteostasis, and it causes these tau to misfold, causing those tangles that we saw a few slides before and leaving those microtubules expanded and freely floating. So these tau can't bind and stabilize to the microtubule networks, as well as they could before, and it causes for these microtubules to just fall apart, and it leads to improper neuronal functioning. And the other link is the altercation of the steroids that stress causes. So mineral corticoids bind to these receptors in the brain, and they can rapidly affect synaptic activity, which is one of the things that causes these symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So these changes could lead in a change in plasticity of the brain and also neurotransmission, so like blockages in between neurons, potentially causing the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And then glucocorticoids, as we've talked about before, they can alter and cause tau tangles and amyloid beta plaques, just in like we talked about before in the previous slides. So these combined, you can see that these tau tangles and amyloid beta plaques forming because of the steroids caused and secreted by stress are leading to a progression of Alzheimer's and worsening effects. And then obviously we have the dysregulated ion channels. So excess cortisol in the ion channels, as we said, leads to dysregulation. And this dysregulation in channels causes for atrophic alterations in parts of the brain. So basically, stress-induced changes in ion channels can cause these things called Lewy bodies. And Lewy bodies eventually get accumulated and start to become clumps, which is another hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. But they can also cause blood clots and blood clot formation, which further progresses the symptoms. So blood clots in your brain, and eventually, if ion channels are dysregulated and you have tau tangles and amyloid beta plaques, you'll start to see bigger gaps in your brain, and it would lead to the brain kind of shrinking. So in conclusion, we've found out that through this review that stress activates the HPA axis, leading to an increased production of steroids like glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and all of those. And these excess steroids leads to dysregulated ion channels, and the accumulation of tau tangles and amyloid beta plaques, as we've seen, gets in the way of neurons connecting and talking to each other. And these dysregulated ion channels can lead to improper signaling and neuronal death as well, as we saw in the diagram. And then we have tangles, plaques, and cell death, which all further progress Alzheimer's symptoms, like the common ones such as dementia, forgetting to eat, forgetting to take medications, all of those. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to take any questions at this time.